In the last segment, we found out that in the 1840s, one of the things that's happening in American life is we're expanding. Geographically, we're getting larger. We're moving west of the Mississippi River. And in some ways, in many ways actually, what that's doing is it's complicating this relationship that we had that dated back all the way to 1820, in which there was an exactly even number of slave and free states in the Union. Okay. One of the key players within this whole issue of expansion was the president, a guy from Tennessee by the name of James Polk. Polk had basically been elected by publicly favoring the issue of expansion. And one of the first orders of business that he committed to upon becoming president, it was the addition of the state of Texas, or what would become the state of Texas. But the addition of Texas simply whetted Polk's appetite when it comes to geographic expansion of the United States. Now, when I say Texas, it's not exactly the state that you think of it as today. There was disputed territory in between the Nueces River on the north and the Rio Grande to the south. In other words, the area between those two rivers were claimed by both countries, the United States and Mexico. And so what Polk does upon becoming president is he moves troops into that area. That's essentially no man's land, and as far as the Mexican government is concerned, that is their territory. And so from the Mexican perspective, this is seen as an invasion. Now, I guess to be fair to Polk, I'm oversimplifying this, but for the sake of this class, I think that's a pretty fair assessment of what's happening. Now, with foreign troops being on what they consider to be Mexican territory, the Mexican military fires upon the Americans and they kill 11 of them. Now, with this being said, Polk is able to go to Congress and he's able to go ahead and get a declaration of war. There's a lot of historians that believe this was all by design. They believe that what was happening was Polk was trying to expand into what was essentially northern Mexico. And when I say that, I mean states, present-day American states like Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and of course that area in South Texas that I was referring to earlier. He now has that opportunity when war comes between the United States and Mexico. Now, you've been in my class long enough to know that I don't really do the Johnny ran up the hill version of military history, but what I will say is war fever on the American side, especially in the South, it ran very high, considering there were a lot of people that felt that this was a moral crusade, in the sense that the United States was a democracy, Mexico is not. Some people even felt that it was sort of like a monarchy, and it was democracy winning. And so this was, I guess you could call this a popular war from the perspective of the American people. Maybe that's not fair to individuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. As you should know by now, Thoreau actually went to jail for not paying his taxes, which was his attempt, his civil disobedient attempt to end the war with Mexico. But at any rate, what I'd like you to understand here is that the war is relatively short. It lasts approximately 2 years, and is very decisive. The United States defeats Mexico in 1848, and the treaty that ends that war is called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay? Now, this treaty is important for a number of reasons. Number one, it basically grants the United States what at one point in time was northern Mexico. What I mean is the future states of California, Nevada, Utah, a good chunk of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and the area of South Texas that we were talking about in the beginning, those all become American territories. Okay? Now, the other thing that the treaty does is it makes provisions for Mexican nationals that were living in those territories before the war. Now, keep in mind, those are citizens of the country of Mexico. And what the United States says it's going to do in 1848 is make them American citizens. Now, that should probably have an asterisk next to it, considering they don't mean that, tomorrow you're going to be an American citizen. The provision in the treaty said as long as you stayed in one place for a year, you would retain your land rights and you would become a card-carrying member of the United States. That was a big deal at the time, considering Native Americans had their land conquered, and they're certainly not citizens. Even African Americans who could claim citizenship don't exercise full citizenship rights. So, at any rate, you can see that this is a pretty big deal, all things considered, if you consider the context. But at the same time, you have to understand that the war, especially in the East, was perceived as open season on Mexican territory. Okay? Now, what I mean by that is a lot of people felt that the United States was going to war to conquer part of Mexico and take their land from them. And so what you begin to see after the war ends is these Anglo squatters that begin to flood into the Southwest, and they just simply start claiming up Mexican-American territory. Now, if somebody does this, if somebody violates your property, what you do is you take them to court. As a citizen, you have that right to sue them. You have equality under the law, and you have the right to have access to a court, which will enforce the contract. Well, that was true in the sense that after a year, Mexican Americans were full citizens and they did sue Anglo squatters in court, but you keep in mind there's nothing cheap about going to court. So in a lot of ways, these people are rich in the sense that they do own land, but it's not like they have a lot of liquid cash lying around to settle these court fees. So little by little, what you begin to see are Mexican American landowners settling that debt through the granting of land, and it's a little by a little, but at the end of the day, what you have is the erosion of Mexican American land ownership in the Southwest. And once the land transfers away from Mexican American ownership, you basically are talking about a colonized people. It's similar, not in all ways, but in many ways, it's similar to what's happening to the Native Americans back in the East, or what would later on happen in the 1870s with the Sioux on the plains. But at any rate, we now have another third of a continent, and as a matter of fact, this actually does complete the American continental empire. We had an empire from sea to sea. The question then becomes, what is going to become of that new territory? Are you going to make it states? And if you are going to make it states, is it going to be a free state? Is it going to be a slave state? How do we determine that? Well, one individual that had a thought on that was a Pennsylvania congressman. He was a Democrat by the name of David Wilmot. And he proposed something called the Wilmot Proviso. Now, for your notes, what the Proviso said was any territory acquired through the war with Mexico could only become a free state. In other words, slavery would be off limits to all of the territory that was conquered from Mexico. Now, because the population base is generally in the north, this doesn't have much of a problem making its way through the House of Representatives. Anti-slavery is a majority in the House. The problem is the Senate, and as you might imagine, because everyone has an equal say, there's an equal number of slave senators versus non-slave senators, it gets shot down in the Senate. Now, what this does, after this Wilmot Proviso goes away, it really convinces a lot of people of what Henry David Thoreau called a slave power conspiracy. That what the war with Mexico, in fact, was simply an excuse to conquer territory and scatter slavery throughout it. Okay? And clearly that was, as far as they were concerned, that was the reason why the Proviso did not stick. Okay? Now, out of the ashes of David Wilmot's attempt to stop the spread of slavery, we see the emergence of a third political party. You've got the Free Soil Party. Okay? Now, the Free Soil Party is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's a political organization, it's a political party, really, that their platform is no expansion of slavery. There will be no slavery in the territories acquired through war with Mexico. Okay? And in 1848, they run their first candidate for president, and they don't do all that well, but they do make a formidable showing. In other words, there are votes in anti-slavery. Okay? Now, the election of 1848 is an important election for a lot of different reasons, but one of the things that I need you to understand here is there's basically two Democrats running against one Whig, and anytime you split the votes, two people of the same party are running, it very much favors the other party, even if the other party, like the Whigs, are more or less a minority party. So the Democrats nominated a guy from Michigan by the name of Lewis Cass. Now, he was a good candidate for the Democratic Party for a number of different reasons, but primarily he's a northerner. So the idea of a slave power conspiracy is not going to stick the same way that it would if somebody from a state like Tennessee or South Carolina, for instance, were to be nominated. Now, the Free Soil Party nominated Mr. Democrat, Martin Van Buren, and so you've got Cass that is going to have to share votes with Van Buren. The Whig Party nominated a Southerner, maybe the star of the Mexican-American War, a guy from Louisiana named Zachary Taylor. Okay. Now, Taylor ultimately wins this thing because the votes were split. But the big crisis that he inherits as president is what to do with California. In 1849, early 1850, when flakes of gold are found in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, the gold rushes on, and all of a sudden California's population booms. And one of the things that the people of California demand is statehood. They want to come in as a new state in the United States. Zachary Taylor encourages them to do this, and although this might not seem all that likely, considering he was a Southerner and a slave owner himself, he actually encourages them to draft up a constitution that outlaws the institution of slavery. Okay? Now, back in the South, this was seen as absolutely outrageous. Okay? That, you know, they're tossing around the S word, the secession word. Okay? So, if all of this is going to come to pass, then there's need to be something that appeases the South in some form or fashion. Okay? Enter into our conversation the Compromise of 1850. I need you to understand three things about this compromise. First, it does admit California into the Union as a free state. So the North is very happy because they get a one-state advantage in Congress when it comes to representation. 2 more senators and a handful of House of Representative members. The other thing that it says is that the South would get something it wanted, which was a very authoritarian, very draconian anti-runaway law. I'll talk more about the Fugitive Slave Act in just a moment, but the Fugitive Slave Act is absolutely a part of the Compromise of 1850. The last part of the compromise that I need you to be mindful of is it said everything outside of California, in other words, all the territory that we acquired beside California from Mexico, would essentially be put up to what they called squatters' sovereignty. In other words, the people that were living in Nevada, the people that were living in Colorado, would ultimately make up their minds for themselves as to the legality of slavery. Okay? So, at least on paper, from the South's perspective, there's a way to add more states of the slave variety into the Union. Okay? But let me get into this whole Fugitive Slave Act. What I want you to write down next to Fugitive Slave Act is an expansion of the federal government. You have to understand what this law said. First of all, from the African American perspective, this was a reign of terror. All right? It pretty much allowed anybody and everyone who was black, whether you could prove that you were a free citizen or not, pretty much allowed you to be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Not back to slavery, but into slavery. If you were accused of being a runaway, you had no access to, well, you had your day in court, but you had no right to address the court. You couldn't present information. You couldn't present evidence. So, I mean, accusation, more times than not, was perfectly, permissible when it comes to the association of guilt. The other problem, as far as the Fugitive Slave Act is concerned, is the fact that this is unleashing federal marshals in the North. Slave catchers are coming to the North, places like Madison, Wisconsin, and they're going door to door trying to find runaway slaves. Slave catching was big business back during this time period. It was one of the only professions, and I use that term very, very loosely, but it was one of the only professions where you didn't have to have some education or a lot of startup capital and make a decent living from it. Anyway, these slave catchers are escorted by federal marshals that basically are knocking on people's doors and demanding to come inside, and because they are the federal government, they're doing this. They've got the law behind them. The Fugitive Slave Act allows them to enter into private dwellings, including households and businesses, just to make sure that there's no slaves there. Now, for those of you that are saying, isn't this a constitutional violation? You're right. The Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights says that you have a reasonable right to privacy, and unless there's probable cause, in other words, there is a known slave that's a runaway that's waving out of the window, you don't really have the right to go into that private dwelling. Anyway, it's pretty clear how this is both an expansion of the government and also a constitutional crisis at the same time. Okay? Now, one of the people that was very much against the Fugitive Slave Act was a guy that was living in Boston by the name of Lewis Hayden. Now, Hayden was a runaway slave himself, and he had settled in Boston for a lot of different reasons. It did have a vibrant black community, and it was the hub of the abolition movement. As we've talked about in this class before, I mean, Boston really is the bedrock of the abolition movement in the mid-19th century. Now, Lewis Hayden was a known stop, his residence, I mean, was a known stop on the Underground Railroad. And so oftentimes when we think of the Underground Railroad, we think of these poor African-American runaways fleeing to the open arms of their benevolent white rescuers. Not the case, or at least not usually the case. Typically, if you wanted to live to tell about your running away from a state like Tennessee or North Carolina, you ran to the black community, and Lewis Hayden was a known stop in that respect. And so Lewis Hayden also had a bone to pick with a guy that's very central in the architecture of the Compromise of 1850, a guy from Kentucky named Henry Clay. Again, we've talked about him. Henry Clay was a really big voice in the Compromise, and Henry Clay had also, once upon a time, owned Lewis Hayden's wife and son. Well, long story short, Clay sold both his wife and son and basically shattered Hayden's family. And so, obviously, this is not something that if you're Lewis Hayden, that you're going to forget anytime soon. What I'm getting at is Hayden had clearly had a score to settle with the likes of Henry Clay and would do anything and everything within his power to help as many people as he possibly could escape the institution that was slavery. So on this one particular occasion, because it wasn't just the black community that knew that Hayden was a stop on the Underground Railroad, the authorities knew that as well. And so the slave catchers show up at his Boston residence. They're banging on the doors. The federal marshals are behind them. It says, you know, Hayden, we know you're in there, and we know you have slaves, and we're coming in. Hayden opens the door with a torch that's lit, a torch lit in his hand. And he says something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but look, if you're here with the federal government, I guess you're coming in. Guess there's nothing that I can do about it. But before you enter, understand that the stairs upon which you stand right now, they're on his porch, there's kegs of gunpowder underneath them. And next to my foot here is the fuse that leads down to that keg of gunpowder. And I hold here in my hand a lit torch that I'm more than happy to light if you have any plans on stepping 1 foot inside this residence. So in other words, you can leave here in peace, or you can leave here in pieces, okay? As you might imagine, the slave catchers and their federal assistants left in peace, as fast as their feet could carry them, okay? As a matter of fact, in Boston, it was rare that slave catchers had a whole lot of success, simply because of people, both in the black and white community, abolition movement, that were so thoroughly and so militantly organized when it comes to the institution of standing up to slavery. And so we're really at a critical moment in this class. I mean, at the same time that we're trying just to ignore this issue of slavery, half the country's going to do it, half the country hates it, we can't ignore it because every time that we add more territory to the United States, the issue of slavery inevitably presents itself once again. All of this will lead us into the 1850s with the additions of the states of Kansas and Nebraska. And we'll see yet another constitutional crisis, and this time the Supreme Court's going to weigh in on this, will come to the fore when it comes to something we call the Kansas and Nebraska Act. And that's where we'll pick it up the next time we meet.